Hi, good evening, everybody, or good afternoon, depending on what time zone you are all in. My name is Scott Sinclair. I'm the Senior Manager of Programs here at Cancer and Careers, and I want to thank you all for joining us for this webinar today. For those of you who are listening in on your phone, if you could please send us an email to cancerandcareers@cew.org with your name and the phone number that you're dialing in from. That way we can confirm your attendance and make sure that you receive all of the relevant follow-up information for this webinar. Now, if you are new to Cancer and Careers, first of all, welcome. We're glad to have you. We are a national nonprofit and the only program of its kind solely dedicated to empowering and educating people with cancer to thrive in their work environment. This slide has a list of all of our free programming and services that we offer. Our comprehensive website is available in both English and Spanish and is the heart of everything that we do. There you can find various support services, including our resume review service and access to career coaches. Our educational blog and news feed are both rich resources where those who have been diagnosed, their caregivers, employers, and healthcare professionals can stay current on topics related to work and cancer. Our free publication library also is available in both English and Spanish, and they provide tangible, easy to digest information on working and looking for work after a cancer diagnosis. And those are available in both hard copy as well as PDF formats. We also offer numerous events every year, from hour-long webinars like the one you're about to see right now to full-day events. And I will be back at the end of today's webinar to tell you a little bit about what we have coming up. Now, for those of you who are seeking continuing education credits, this slide lists all of the organizations who have accredited today's webinar, as well as the required steps for getting a certificate. And just a reminder that we are not accredited by ANCC for today's webinar, but hopefully we will be in the future. This information is also available on our website, and a link to the evaluation and the post-test will be shared at the conclusion of the webinar today. So please take a moment to complete them at that point. However, if you're not able to do it right away, no worries. We're going to send you an email tomorrow, Thursday, November 7th, no later than 5 p.m. Eastern. So keep an eye out for those tomorrow as well. Now, again, for those of you who are planning to request continuing education credits, our accrediting bodies require us to share this slide and to let you know that there are no conflicts of interest to report. Now, as you might know, Zoom has a lot of great features which you can use to interact with this event with us and as well as other attendees. You'll see a Q&A box on your features panel, either at the top or the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions today about the content that Nicole and Brandon are about to talk you through, please submit your questions in the Q&A box. And we know the importance of privacy, so there is an option to submit your questions anonymously. We'll do our best to get to everyone's questions today, but please be patient. If we don't get to your question today, please shoot us an email. Again, that's cancerandcareers@cew.org, and we'll make sure that we get you an individual follow-up response to that. You'll also see a chat box in your features panel. You can use that to communicate with our speakers, our staff, our other attendees. However, it's important to note that the chat box is not private and it will show your name as it appears in Zoom. So that's just something to be mindful of when or if you decide to engage in the chats. Also, we just ask you that not to put your Q&A questions in the chat box, as we might miss your question there. So any questions you have should go in the Q&A box, not in the chat box. Also, please note that today's presentation is copyrighted. Therefore, the use of AI assistants and or transcribing or recording devices of any kind by attendees is not allowed. Those who are found using AI or other recording or transcription software during CAC programming will be removed from the event, and you will be permitted to return without the AI or recording or transcription software. Now, real-time closed captioning is available for today's event for those who need it, and a caption recording of this webinar will be archived on our website following the session. To request any additional reasonable accommodations, please send an email to cancerandcareers@cew.org at least 24 hours before any other live sessions. Now, thanks in part to Genentech and P&G Beauty, Cancer and Careers is very proud to offer the 10th year of our Balancing Work in Cancer webinar series, which was created to provide anyone whose life has been touched by cancer with concise, targeted information about work-related issues that arise after a diagnosis. Additionally, we would like to recognize Cancer and Careers as year-round sponsors who support all of our core programming and allow us to continue providing our resources and services free of charge. Now, as many of you know, cancer often impacts more than just the person with the diagnosis. Now, for those of you in a caregiving role, there are often new emotional and practical responsibilities taken on. It can often feel as if those who are caregiving are working two full jobs, which can lead to feeling overwhelmed. The challenge is to meet those many responsibilities while also preserving energy for yourself, your family, and your job. Now, to help walk you through this tonight, we are really pleased to be joined by Brandon Gottlieb and Nicole Jarvis. Brandon has more than 20 years of experience in the talent acquisition industry and is currently the Director Talent Advisor at the largest nonprofit health plan in New York State. He's also one of CAC's volunteer career coaches and has personal experience as a caregiver to his daughter. Nicole is our Assistant Director of Programs here at Cancer and Careers and is also one of our in-house social workers. Now, like I said, I will be back at the end of tonight's presentation to facilitate questions with Brandon and Nicole. So drop any questions you have in that Q&A box and we'll do our best to answer all of them. But without further ado, I am going to hand it over to Nicole and Brandon.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you all for being here this evening, as well as Brandon. We really appreciate it. I know that evening webinars can be a little bit challenging, so we'll try to keep it good tonight. So I do want to start out today by talking about something that many caregivers may relate to. Now, we know that people diagnosed with a serious or chronic medical condition often find themselves confronting some common misconceptions as they're related to work. So these can include things like they don't want to work, or they won't be as productive because of their caregiving responsibilities, or perhaps that because they themselves are technically fine, they don't need any special consideration on the job. Now, because many of us know these are largely faulty assumptions, they also serve as barriers to other people understanding the full picture of an individual's experience. So really one of our goals for this evening is to illustrate that there is so much more nuance involved with caregiving in the workplace than a lot of these misconceptions tend to allow for. Now, there have been numerous studies conducted over the past few years as the circumstances surrounding balancing work and caregiving have really come to light. The AARP Public Policy Institute released a study, a report on caregiving in 2020, and this illustrated many caregivers' shared experiences. Now, the majority of caregivers were managing work either part-time or full-time while caregiving. You could see that numbers nearly 48 million Americans are caregivers, and 61% of this group employed at some time. So that shows that there was a lot of this balancing act going on between caregiving and work. And here we see another study conducted by S&P Global and AARP on caregiving in 2023 that surveyed 1,200 employees. And this survey was made to accurately represent the caregiving population among the US working population. Now, as is evident, challenges existed in the balancing of these responsibilities, as well as some of the approaches and strategies caregivers had to take in order to manage work and caregiving. Now, looking at these, there was certainly a struggle with the majority of caregivers that were working. And some of the approaches that they took included taking time off, cutting back work hours, and potentially having to decline promotions as a result of having to really be realistic with their time management. Now, this is, of course, not everyone, but it can be really validating to recognize that these are some of the ways that caregivers were balancing their work and caregiving responsibilities, some that may strike you as well as some that may spark some new ideas for how to approach it. And, you know, we really can't discuss the experience of caregiving without digging into some of the challenges that are associated. Now, from that same AARP study, 3 primary struggles were cited. There was the mental strain. So feelings of stress, guilt, anger, anxiety, and so much more were prevalent among caregivers. There's also physical strain. So experiencing their own health challenges as a result of this new amount of emotional stress, but also some of the physical aspects, such as having less personal time in the day to address self-care, less sleep, perhaps not the ability to work out if you do that, more household tasks, etc. So I wonder if you can speak a little bit to that based on your own experience, Brandon, of some of these strains.
Sure, and thank you for having me. Yeah, I mean, on a personal note, having been a caregiver for our daughter for 4 years, I can certainly relate to these statistics. You know, you often live day to day. You often don't really know where you have to be the next day. You often are waiting. There's a lot of waiting when you're caregiving, a lot of waiting for results, good news, bad news. It weighs on you heavily. And you know, I know we're going to get to a lot of these types of challenges throughout the hour.
So this final struggle that was identified was financial strain, which I think doesn't necessarily come as a surprise to most people. Um, Obviously can be really challenging to plan for since there's no set timeline and it's not like it's something that you had planned for originally. And many caregivers often take on debt. So this can include medical debt for treatments for your loved one, loss of income if your partner has to stop working, loss of income for yourself if your work hours are cut or you need to take time off. So this is certainly something that is particularly challenging because it's that tangible challenge that's a little bit different than that mental strain. Because obviously, as you can see here, on average, there's up to $10,000 a year in caregiving expenses. And there's a big contrast in terms of the caregivers with no strain or one work-related strain. So
Yeah, I mean, we in many, as you said, I mean, in many cases, you know, reducing work automatically has to means reduced income, and you know, you don't. That shouldn't be the driving factor as to what kind of commitment you can make, right, when it comes to caregiving, especially in a case like mine when it's your child. You know, it's almost like you just sort of don't really get to think about the financial aspect of it until much later in the game. But there have been certainly have been instances of people that even I've met along the way, you know, dipping into retirement savings, household costs, even remembering to pay bills, which could cause issues, you know, financially. If you don't, you know, you miss a credit card payment because you just haven't had the chance to pay bills or something. That kind of stuff can collectively add up.
yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that could be kind of one of those practical strategies that you could apply of checking off the auto pay for certain things
Yeah,
that you know you're going to be able to pay
yeah.
and you know, making sure that there's a system in place so that you avoid any other challenges that might arise financially, which as you mentioned, there can be a lot. So, you know, today we really want to focus on thinking through a caregiving circumstance and how to best approach making decisions around those best plans of action. Now, it's important to remember that you shouldn't feel obligated to make decisions right away or even all at once. This can and likely will be a very fluid process. It's likely that you may experience a range of emotions related to processing your loved one's diagnosis as well. These can include shock, stress, anxiety, depression, numbness, an urgency to get things moving, and the list unfortunately does go on. Now, regardless of the specifics, it's important to remember and know that your feelings are valid. There's really no right reaction in these types of scenarios. And while you may feel that you need to be stoic for your loved one, sometimes allowing yourself to feel those emotions can be an important part of preparing to make future decisions. And then really giving yourself the space to breathe and process can help you get centered and focus so that those next steps do feel a little bit more manageable. Now, over the next few slides, Brandon and I are going to discuss what it looks like to identify and ask yourself key questions, gather information, get organized with that information that's gathered to really better understand what your options may be, and to make an action plan for moving forward that really works around your loved one's treatments, surgeries, and medical interventions, as well as how your work may fit into all of these factors. So it's certainly a juggling act. So trying to be organized about it can make it a little bit of a smoother process.
I love that first box on the last slide of just breathing. I think that first step is it's a critical step. And you mentioned, having a clear mind. I mean, these are the types of things you want to wait until you have a bit of a moment of clarity, I mean, even if you're sort of in the mindset of course I will be there to help. Of course I'll make myself available. You have to ask yourself, what can potentially be some difficult questions just in preparing for the reality of this, right? What are your loved ones' needs? You're delivering on a commitment to them, right? What are your needs and wants? How might they be impacted? Will your experience a financial impact as we just discussed? How will your caregiving responsibilities impact your work-life balance? How is your identity connected to work? These types of questions are sometimes different for everyone. Everyone's commitment is different. For example, a caregiver might be someone who just needs to provide an hour a week, a ride to a place. And other times, like in mine and my wife's case, it's a 24/7 job. Another question I think is also good to ask is who can you rely on? Who can you count on? The caregiver will inevitably need someone themselves to be there. Certainly, for my wife and I, we had moments where we needed to lean on others, maybe grandparents to pick up our other daughter from the school bus, or to be home for a delivery that's coming that you can't be left outside because everyone's sending food. Like there's things that you really need to be prepared for in advance for the commitment that you're making.
Yeah, and certainly when you're putting so much of yourself forward, it can be hard to ask for help. But in circumstances like these, it's so necessary because there's only so much one or two people can handle at a time and not feel totally overwhelmed. So those smaller things are certainly worth exploring who you can rely on. So that's definitely a great question to add in there. So once you've asked yourself those many questions, you are going to need to, as we discussed, begin gathering some necessary information. And so we separate these into a couple of buckets so that they're just a little bit easier to organize and kind of work through. The first is information on your loved one's medical and practical needs. So this includes things like appointments, treatments, surgeries, timelines, needs, and side effects. But you'll also want to consider and look into your own medical and practical information, since your needs and health are not completely on hold at this time. So you might want to look into some support and resources that might benefit you as well. And also making sure to consider what other personal obligations you have. Obviously, being a caregiver to a loved one who's ill is not always on your bingo card, right? And so you want to make sure that you are prioritizing your other obligations as well. And it's also important to look into your own work information like policies, PTO and leave banks, and really taking into consideration what the culture and job demands are at your workplace, because these can all really lend insight into helping you to make more informed decisions. And finally, it is worth gathering legal information about federal, state, and local laws that may be applicable to working caregivers. And this is sometimes something that you might have to do a little bit more legwork on your own, because it's not automatically offered up at some of these appointments and things of that nature that you're joining your loved one on. So to start, medical information should really be gathered from your loved one's healthcare team. So as I mentioned, this can include timelines for surgery and chemo or radiation. It can also include potential side effects and understanding those. And this information can really help you to figure out whether it's going to be possible for you to work during all or even some of your loved one's treatment, or if you might actually need to take time off. So as you mentioned before, your wife and you had to be there 24/7, right? But alternatively, some people might need to only be a ride, right? And so they may not need to be taking off so much time. It's also helpful as well to understand the extent to which you'll physically be needed as a caregiver. So if side effects will really hit them hard, you want to figure out what a realistic plan will look like if you do need to be physically present for them at more often. It's also a good idea, as I mentioned, to become aware of supportive services that are available, such as transportation, financial assistance opportunities, as well as just specific guidance on how to best play the caregiver role. It's not necessarily something people will naturally lean into. So having a couple of pointers and things to consider can be really helpful. And so a hospital social worker can also help with these. And I wonder if you have any from your personal experience that you might think would be helpful.
Yeah, certainly. This is terrific. I mean, depending on the relationship, the caregiver sometimes does or doesn't get access into the room. I mean, in our case, that was always the case. We were always there. We were always talking directly with doctors or providers. But whenever possible, having firsthand information as much as you can is critical, and not to rely solely on secondhand information passed down from your loved one. And like I said, with us, it was easy. But I often wonder if it was my mother, would she, what would she be telling me? What would I hear from her firsthand? If it was secondhand, would I really be hearing everything that I need to hear to care for her? I'm sure it would have been a very different experience. And I would also say that this also helps, for financial discussions as well. They typically for these long-term caregiving needs, there's opportunities to talk with a financial advisor or financial representative from the company, and hearing that firsthand so that you can potentially help on that front, even if it's helping them pay their bills, helping them be organized, I think is really helpful. And you mentioned social workers. I would also say that depending on, where you are, what the situation is, in our case, there are also what you call sort of patient advocates or caregiver advocates. These are usually volunteers who check in regularly with patients and caregivers, and you should take advantage of them when you have questions, when you have concerns. If you can't find the answer, they'll find the answer for you most of the time, put you in front of the right people, and they're usually easily accessible than trying to get to a doctor potentially.
Right. Yeah. And I know that I had worked at Sloan Kettering for a while, and they offered
Where we were.
patient financial navigators. And so they can be really helpful in terms of identifying potential local resources as well. Because some of the more national programs tend to run out of money pretty quickly. So it can be helpful if you have a social worker working in a hospital near you that can identify a certain charity or organization that provides things specifically to people in certain zip codes and things like that. So it is worth, perusing hospital websites to see what kind of support services there are.
So researching policies and benefits related to your job, as Nicole alluded to earlier, is very important. Work relationships with your supervisor, with your team, with colleagues, they really come into play here, depending on the situation. And this was certainly the case for me. I had to ask myself every day, where do I need to be tomorrow? I could not necessarily think too far ahead, and that's challenging when you're trying to work. On any day, I might be telling, my colleagues that I need to reschedule everything for that day. And so, I had to share with them a certain amount of information that unfortunately there were times when everything was up in the air. But from an HR perspective, these policies, and hopefully, you work for a company that has sort of legitimate, policies that are accessible. But either, and if they do have them, they're typically readily available either through an HR contact or perhaps a company has an intranet where they post their policies. But this is really important to make sure that you're reviewing, and that's where you might find, the employee handbook or policies on leave and things like that. I would also mention that, if there's caregivers on this call right now, then, I'd like to say that even knowing about cancer and careers, even being here is certainly a good sign that you're doing the right thing, and that you're making the efforts to look for resources. That's probably goes above and beyond what most caregivers get to do. And then the last point that I would make is when we talk about research, this is probably one of the times where it's a good idea to search the internet. When it comes to diagnoses or first hearing about your loved one's diagnosis, that can steer you in a very dangerous direction. We don't recommend, I don't know about you, Nicole, I certainly do not recommend, and doctors usually do not recommend searching the internet. But when it comes to state laws, company policies, resources like Cancer and Careers, that is a good time to do some real research.
Absolutely. Yeah. When we say gather information, we certainly do not mean
No, I know.
from your own doctor.
It's hard not to, though. It is hard
Yeah,
not to.
absolutely.
It is hard not to. But yeah.
Yeah, it's the curse of WebMD, right?
No.
You can get down a rabbit hole that
Yeah.
will not serve you well. So, but in this circumstance, I agree. Yes, use the internet to your advantage. There's so much information at your fingertips. And sometimes the only thing preventing you from having access to it is looking for it. So it's certainly worth putting some time aside to gather this information. And as I mentioned earlier, we do recommend gathering legal information as well. And I want to, be sure to say that it's not because we think it's likely that a situation will become litigious, but rather for many people, we've recognized that the law really becomes a key tool for helping them to pull together a plan for working while balancing those additional responsibilities of caregiving. Now, as I mentioned, I'm a social worker. You can see on my little thing up here, I am not an attorney, much to my parents' dismay. But if you are interested in learning more about which federal or state workplace laws and protections may or may not be available to you, it is worth reaching out to a legal professional to confirm. And Cancer and Careers can certainly provide resources if those of you on the call are interested. And again, as we mentioned, the internet, you can find broad, reliable information about laws on various government websites, as well as educational blogs and resources. And we will, as I mentioned, have some resources at the end of the presentation as well. And in terms of the legal aspects from your HR perspective, Brandon, what do you think might be important?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to most laws are also based on size of company, right? And so obviously if you're working for a large global company, you'll get a certain expectations but a lot of people work for small companies. A lot of people work for mom and pop shops. A lot of companies, especially small businesses, might want to be accommodating. It's not that they personally, don't want to, but they just might not have the infrastructure to support your needs. And so it's vital that caregivers understand the laws of their states. New York, for example, just again, for me, if I had gone on leave, I would only have been eligible for a certain amount of my salary that was capped at an amount of money that did not work for me if my wife was not working at all. So for us, I really had to figure out the balance, and I had to really make sure that I understood what my options were and for how long and set expectations.
Mm-hmm. And when you were utilizing some of this information to make those decisions, were you primarily looking at the information that you had access to as an HR representative, or was it doing your own research as well?
Yeah. So again, now I won't rely on my own, especially in the emotional state that I probably was in at the time. So it was really important that I spoke at the time. I worked for a company that wasn't necessarily a New York-based company, and that was a little bit challenging just because I was physically in one state. And so you had to really look into that. But one thing, and I think we'll get to this maybe in a little bit, but I also was able to sort of know the path. Like I knew I had to do this for 8 weeks and then the break and then that. And so that also helped me, sort of navigate through what was available and what wasn't. And again, this is where, my being in HR let me have certain connections, but again, I think many times that, when you're working with someone, when you're dealing with other people in this industry, hopefully there's some empathy there. They're hopefully trained with empathy and they're, helpful and resources are available, but you have to do your own due diligence.
Yeah. You have to be your own advocate and advocate for your loved one as well.
Yeah.
Well, while we're on the topic of some of the laws that are relevant, there is one, the Family and Medical Leave Act, or FMLA, as many people are aware of. And eligible caregivers may be able to access job protected and health insurance protected leave under the FMLA. And so this also may allow qualified individuals to take time off to care for a spouse, a parent, or child with a serious medical condition. Again, since we are not a legal organization, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this today. For more information, you can certainly check out our website as well as the resources I mentioned we listed at the end of today. But it is worth noting also that some states also have laws that offer protections for working caregivers. So we do recommend looking into those too. Very often the state fair employment laws tend to cover a little bit more and provide a little bit more protection when it comes to in comparison to the federal laws available as well. And another relevant federal law that I want to spend a little time on is the Americans with Disabilities Act, also known as the ADA. It is a federal law and it applies in all 50 states. And like all laws, there are certain requirements that must be met in order to use it. Now, what's important for all of you to know is that eligible caregivers may be protected from discrimination under the ADA, but they are not entitled to reasonable accommodations, which are an additional benefit that may be available to the person that you're caring for if they are currently working. But with that said, many employers are willing to make accommodations that allow caregivers to stay on the job, simply because they want to support valued employees. Hiring, training, keeping employees is no easy task, and it costs a lot of money and there's a lot of investment. So in order to, get the return on that investment, you want to be supportive to your employees. So some of these modifications or accommodations might include working a full-time but flexible schedule. So perhaps working the same number of hours but distributing them differently. So perhaps if your loved one tends to have afternoon appointments, perhaps your 9 to 5 becomes a 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. so that you can take off those afternoons. Another option might be working remotely, part-time or full-time. And this can not only save your time on a draining commute and reserve your energy, but it can allow you to be physically close to your loved ones if they need you throughout the day. And as I mentioned, employers likely will want to do everything to help keep you on the job. So it's really worth getting creative about potential solutions that can both help you and make sure that nothing slips in between the cracks at your job. So now that you've gotten all of this information, it can feel extremely overwhelming because there's so much of it. And you're also participating in the coordination of care for your loved one and addressing your own existing needs. So really focusing on getting organized is really helpful. Now, with this necessary information in hand, you can sit down and assess options for what your work and schedule will look like. And you'll also want to look at your options when it comes to who and what to tell about your situation. You want to think, do you prefer to keep this between you and your supervisor? Is it helpful to inform coworkers so that they're aware? These are all decisions to make based on what you've learned or come across in your information and gathering phase. Also, getting and staying organized can help remove some of the strain and stress from work and help you to be better prepared for having a plan A or B or C. It's possible and very likely that your plan may not work out exactly as you anticipated. So having some extra information on hand to be able to pivot when necessary can also really reduce some of that stress and help you to plan ahead so that you're not stuck in the moment, having something not work out and then have to go back to the drawing board completely. So it's important for us to share some best practices for getting and staying organized. So first, keeping all your paperwork and documents in one place can seem like a really simple thing, but it can make a huge difference. It can reduce the headache of searching for important details that are necessary in order to make appointments or navigate insurance. It's also common when fact-finding to come across information that may not be relevant today, but could be useful down the line. So as I mentioned, plans change, plans may not work. So having that extra information on hand can make it really easy. And make sure to store it in a centralized storage location so that you know where to look for it when the time does come. Helping track questions or concerns or thoughts of the person you're caring for can be really helpful if perhaps cognitive challenges or fatigue or just the stress of treatment tends to impact their memory or yours. This could really ensure that nothing gets missed during appointments or other conversations with providers. And it can also help if you don't have to rely solely on your memory as you are juggling everything at once. And that can get pretty overwhelming and tend to, again, let some things fall through the cracks if you're not careful.
This is critically important, as you allude to. I mean, being organized can help just that much more on a stress level of an already like really emotional issue, right? So it can only be more stressful the more chaos involved, and you're often you know it's often necessary to pull up an old bill or pull up a thing that you think you already helped pay, or a thing that a note that one doctor said, and now you have to go meet a new doctor because that doctor's not here that day. You have to be really as prepared and organized as you can be to support your loved one, right? And so for us, in our personal situation, we had a binder with everything in it. I leaned on my calendar considerably. I had alerts for everything. I had alerts for when my daughter needed to take her meds. I had alerts for when we might hear from a doctor, just in case I was in a meeting. I wanted to be able to answer the phone around the hour that he told me that, we might get a call. So this is a really important point. If we're going, yeah, so we move to the next slide. So you can there's some additional points here that I want to stress on. It says taking notes during important conversations with medical professionals and employers, et cetera. What I think in this particular slide has a recommendation that I particularly like, especially towards the beginning of the process, and that's the audio voice recording option. Most phones these days obviously allow for this type of technology fairly easily, and as this slide alludes to, always ask first. You want to make sure that the provider of care agrees with that. In my case, most doctors did, especially at the beginning. Your brain is moving a mile a minute. You're barely hearing every other word that the person's saying. All you're hearing is cancer or this or that. And it's extremely helpful to take down, jot these notes if you can record. It really does helpful. It's helpful to review it later, when you have a clearer head, or to take additional notes after the fact, or more importantly, to maybe confirm the notes that you did take on next steps. These are and I know that sometimes these sound like obvious, but in the heat of the moment, when you've got a million things in your own life going on, it is really important to take a moment and make sure that you're getting the information you need to get.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, writing everything down is such an important aspect. It's so easy to walk out of the appointment thinking that you heard everything and then being like, wait, what was that one thing that they said? Did they say it's next week? Did they say it's in 2 weeks? So certainly really important to write everything down. And again, it sounds simple, but sometimes it's the most simple actions that really help us the most. Sometimes a good idea also is to record the names of people who are helpful at the hospital. So you can ask for them if you need to call for updates, or if you are looking for a little bit more inside information. Make sure to jot down any tips given to you from others in the caregiving community. I know that the cancer space is a really generous space in terms of people being supportive of one another. So if you're in those waiting rooms or you're in the chemo unit all day and there's other caregivers, they might be able to provide you with some helpful tips and suggestions. And of course, it can be a really challenging and isolating experience being responsible for the care of someone else, particularly someone who is ill. So really learning from others' experiences can help kind of take some of the question out of the constant guessing game of what should I do, where should I go, how should I do it, kind of things. Now, moving on from getting organized to actually creating an action plan, to the extent that it's possible, can really help to empower you and maybe even regain some of the control over your work circumstances that may feel a little fleeting at the moment. So we just like to sort of go over what a successful action plan is made up of. So you want to make sure that it addresses your needs and goals as both a person and caregiver. So that includes work, caregiving, personal life, anything else that falls under that, under your identity umbrella. And also identify priorities while remaining relatively flexible. As we've discussed, things tend to evolve due to the fluidity of treatment and changes and reactions and responses. You also want your action plan to incorporate your employer's needs as well as your own. So this is by no means us saying that you should ever put your employer's needs above yours, or that there's no room to really negotiate how work is going to get done. But it's important to make sure that these get woven into your thinking as well. As we mentioned before, you want to identify people that you can rely on, and asking for help can be challenging. But doing so when and where you do feel comfortable can alleviate some of the stress and worries that may be weighing you down. So at work, this could mean creating a plan with your supervisor that you both feel comfortable with, and perhaps maybe asking for regular check-ins just to make sure everyone's feeling good about the process at hand. And also, again, write everything down. So we encourage keeping what's called a work diary. And a work diary can be particularly helpful as a place to really lay out concerns and potential solutions in one place. So what changes do you anticipate to your work life? A different schedule or not being in person as much may mean that you need to rethink how to best continue to get your work done. You want to think realistically about what it might look like to take leave or work flexible hours. If your leave is unpaid, or if, as you mentioned, it's just a fraction of what you were getting, what kind of impact does that have on you? For many, it can be challenging, again, to ask for help, but really try to develop some of that comfort with doing so, because it can make a really big difference. So talking with your supervisor about perhaps redelegating responsibilities for the time being. Or if you have kids, as Brendan mentioned, maybe asking friends or family if they're able to pick them up from school or take them to activities or play dates or babysit, what have you. This way you're able to focus your attention and energy on your caregiving responsibilities. Boundaries are an important aspect of balancing life and work for everyone. So when caregiving is thrown into the mix, you want to really be able to set your boundaries. And we'll talk a little bit more on setting boundaries, but for now, I will say that a work diary can be a really good place to jot down thoughts you have about where those might be needed. If you're noticing like, wow, I spent a lot of time with this one person explaining this project and I've already done this, I need to be able to say, no, go back to our notes or what have you. And also remember, the ability to pivot your plan, your action plan is really necessary. And it's key to setting yourself up for success. So keeping some of that extra information on hand in this work diary can be helpful as well. And this is also a place that you can map out an overview of your loved one's treatment, along with type of support that may be required from you. This can include important dates like surgery and chemo, and information about those recovery times and potential side effects. And you also want to compare your work calendar to treatment schedules to kind of be able to identify any conflicts that may arise. So there may be certain appointments, of course, that are date specific, but it's always worth talking with a healthcare professional and your team to see where there might be flexibility. Because your schedule really is an area where there's more opportunity for you to be, a more active participant in making that plan. Was there anything that worked particularly well for you in terms of creating that plan for yourself?
Well, here, this is where hopefully technology can help, right? I mean, it helps to consolidate, on my phone, I can have sort of 3 different calendars I'm looking at the same time that are different colors. And so I can literally see where I need to be on the caregiving side of my life at the same time when I, a work event would pop up. And so for me, I sort of tried to embrace technology wherever I could, even when it comes to getting my thoughts out on the page sometimes. And
Yeah, so even just scheduling time for yourself to write, or scheduling time into
they
that
call it
calendar.
dedicated time, right? Like you have to block out time on your calendar sometimes just for yourself, and
Yeah, which
I
is
still
really
do that.
important. I mean, I know I personally don't do well when I'm focused and then I'm getting messages and I'm, all over the place. So just being able to schedule that time for yourself to really focus on yourself is very, very helpful. recording your day-to-day activities at work can also be really helpful. As you know, there's often uh, a lot of different things going on and things fly through your mind, so it can be difficult to really kind of prioritize everything and remember when you've actually completed the tasks at work and what day that was and when did you have that meeting. It can all kind of mesh together. So really helping to describe your projects and the associated tasks and writing those all down in your working cancer diary can be really helpful as well. It can help you stay organized and manage your time. And also it creates a log of tasks that you have accomplished. So in the worst case scenario, if something arises at work where you're being told you didn't do something, but you know that you did, this is an opportunity for you to look back on those notes and be like, oh yeah, I actually did turn that into your desk on, such and such a date. And again, it's not that we think that it's likely that the worst case scenarios will arise, but it is worth being prepared and kind of putting yourself in a more secure spot so that you don't have to worry as much that things are going to come back, to bite you. I don't know if there's anything else you'd want to
Yeah,
add.
I mean, what I would say is like these, having this work diary is also sort of it's making things actionable, right? So sometimes you're just listing things out to clear your head, but sometimes you're actually, doing it in a way where you're actually doing the work, right? So you're making sort of actionable tasks that you have to do, and then this way, when you only have a limited amount of time, you're just focused and you just sort of can almost like check off like a checklist, like literally just get them done and then
Mhm.
move to the next thing. I was in some ways, and this is where sort of my job in HR and my professional life came in was sort of helpful, was that I could probably do about 80% of my job from a laptop or a phone. And that's
Mhm.
certainly not the case for everyone. And I clearly remember, other families that we would see every day when we were on similar schedules, and they did not have those kinds of roles. They were either working or they were not there and they were not working. And it was extremely challenging. I had the ability to find these moments where you can check in, catch up, respond to a quick email. But if you're going to make any commitment to any amount of work, then you need to be organized enough so that you can deliver on that amount.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's worth also exploring where there are options for being remote that may not be totally natural for the role, but I think if the pandemic taught us anything, it's that a lot of
Right.
jobs that we thought originally could not be done it from home can. So
Yeah. Yeah.
it's worth, as I mentioned earlier, just being a little bit creative. Now, whether or not to disclose your caregiver status at work is a really important consideration, but it can also be very complex. So I want to just spend a few slides discussing it. We tend to tell people that disclosure exists on a spectrum. So keep in mind that it's not an all or nothing decision. Whatever you feel comfortable with is valid, and sharing nothing is also always an option. And you always want to remember to consider how your loved one feels about you sharing details about them in your workplace. Now, for those of you who do decide to disclose, you'll want to think about what and how much your supervisor and coworkers really need to know, and know that the need for sharing may change over time as the process is fluid. You want to remember that how much you share is entirely up to you. You can always share more, but once information has been disclosed, it cannot be unshared. So it's really, I encourage people to keep it a little closer to the vest to start, and then, assess your situation as it goes on and decide if it's necessary to share more information or if you would like to share more information. Disclosure on the online space can have potential ramifications in the workplace, both for you and the person you're caring for. So we definitely recommend you each develop a personal disclosure plan for your online presence and really making clear decisions about what information about the cancer journey is okay to share online and off. Also where you plan to share it as well. And then you really want to make sure that you're communicating those decisions with the people in your network, because this can help to prevent accidental unwanted disclosures. And even if you have shared those preferences, it's still a good idea to monitor what others are posting so you have a sense of what's out there. You want to really keep in mind there's a potential long-term impact of online disclosure. So it may be the case that some of you or your loved one have shared at work and everyone is being really supportive, and that's a great situation to be in. But the fact is the internet doesn't go away, and none of us can really predict the future. So you may find that your very supportive boss moves on and the new person that took over their role is Googling their new staff. And there's really no way to know how that person's going to respond to the information that they find. So perhaps they find out that you are a caregiver and might be away from the office a lot. Is that going to alter how they're treating you or the responsibilities and projects that they're giving you? So I wonder if you can speak to that both as a HR person and as a caregiver.
So yeah, 2 points I would want to, I think, make here. First, from an HR perspective, most companies have social media policies, right? But those policies tend to involve posting on the company's behalf, using their logos, things like that. But they don't necessarily restrict you from having a personal account. However, when it comes to different platforms, and now there's probably more than there ever been, but I strongly recommend that sort of using social media outlets the way they're intended, right? So for example, LinkedIn may not be the appropriate social media platform to share updates about your personal life or your loved one's condition. Facebook or Instagram stories that disappear after 24 hours might be preferable, if you choose to share anything at all. But what we preferred, and what I think I would recommend here, from an HR perspective to protect yourself, is that, there are niche sites, right, where you can create your presence, you can share information about your health, your family members' health journeys, that can only be seen by specific people with a specific link, right? And otherwise are unfindable, right?
Mhm.
That was our preference. We only wanted to share with the people that we wanted to share with. And communication, as you mentioned, is critical. You must be on the same page with your loved ones about what is shared online. The second point that I wanted to make was that, I think, as you sort of alluded to, it doesn't always end with a post, right? So you don't want to share anything on social media unless you're prepared to hear from people who will see it. Okay. And what I mean by that is to say, I don't need someone I went to kindergarten with and I'm friends with on Facebook to be asking me how my daughter's doing. I'm not,
Mhm.
right? So it might be best to create an email contact group for specific people that you only share updates with. That's what my wife and I did. We had like our, handful of emails that we saved. We just send that out, updates
Mhm.
out to that. Otherwise, no one else needs to know.
Yeah, it can be really helpful to just get it all out in one. So in terms of having to tell your employer and disclose to them, generally speaking, there's no requirement to share this information, but obviously there may be people who decide to for a variety of reasons, perhaps legal benefits or interpersonal benefits to disclosing, maybe even practical benefits. Obviously, some people are sharers and can't imagine going through this and not sharing, while others have absolutely no interest in sharing their private information in the workplace. So you want to really think about the workplace culture. Is it a small company where everyone feels like family and you already share a lot of information, or is it a little bit more corporate and buttoned up? So that's really part of the decision of should you tell. When contemplating who to tell, it can really depend on your specific circumstances. So we tend to encourage people to start with whoever's easiest to talk to, which is typically a supervisor, since they are going to be there on an ongoing basis and might be able to advocate for you with some of the higher ups. However, most managers are not trained to be managers, so it may be the first time they're having this conversation. So you want to really come prepared. And so we actually have something called a manager's toolkit, which is linked on the bottom of this slide, that really outlines ways that managers can be most supportive to employees who are either diagnosed themselves or are caregiving for someone who is. Now, for others, a supervisor's out of the question, so you might turn to HR. They're the ones who understand all those employer policies that you did the research and gathered information on, so they can be really helpful. They may have been in this scenario in the past as well. So just knowing that really the underlying theme is that you want your employer to understand that you're going to communicate with them in the most updated way that you can, and what you're telling them today is what you know to be true today.
So perhaps you've made the decision that you do need to disclose, right? Preparing yourself for disclosing, taking a moment and sort of putting yourself in your manager's position or putting yourself in the position of the person you're talking to is something I think we're going to talk about a little bit more. But what would you want to know, or how would you want to be assured if this was someone that worked for you or worked for your company? You'd want to communicate with your employer and reassure productivity will not suffer as a result of support, that you assure your employer there'll be open communication and dialogue throughout, set up regular check-ins. And you have to decide what information you're comfortable sharing. The example I would give you is there was a certain part of the time when I in treatment for my daughter where she was losing her hair and had to shave her head, and I shaved my head. And that meant I was walking into the office one day where not that many people knew what was going on with a shaved head. And I knew that that alone was, in a way, disclosing that there was something going on. And it was a decision I had to be prepared for. So you want to strategically express any requests you may have with your employer so you can work together to meet your needs. In other words, coming prepared that you've sort of thought about the things that they're going to be concerned about shows that you're making the effort.
Yeah, absolutely.
And preparing for potential challenges. This is just expanding on what we're talking about here, right? Now more than ever, modified work arrangements are more acceptable. There's more options. This was not the case. We were going through things during when my daughter, this was pre-COVID that we were going through, but certainly now there's hopefully more options available to you for remote work, for flexible time. But that can have its own challenges. Modified work arrangements may cause resentment among coworkers. Maybe there are other people on your team going through things who haven't disclosed that no one is aware of, and that could cause some animosity. So, speak with your supervisor about how to make sure coworkers feel comfortable with the setup. Make sure everyone sort of knows as much as they need to know to keep the work time like focused on work, and you can actually get through the day without any sort of feelings of uncomfortability.
Yeah.
And a lack of a clear plan of your time away from the office can really cause confusion. And that's the most important thing, is to try to minimize the confusion on their part as much as you can.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, we'll do this pretty quickly. I'm seeing the time.
Oh,
But obviously with so much juggling going on, and this balancing act can feel really overwhelming. So we encourage people to just go back to basics, doing one thing at a time, prioritizing when you're making lists, creating cheat sheets. And as we mentioned, building breaks into your day can really help you to reset when you're starting to feel really overwhelmed. It can also help to identify a point person. So this is someone that you can go to, similar to how you said you started an email. Sometimes that can be really helpful as having someone who can let everybody else know all the things that they need to know or that you feel they need to know. And then you also want to make sure that you are clear on what your work priorities are and that you're aligned with your supervisor and team as far as expectations. So as we mentioned on the last slide, just making sure that you have a clear plan. And of course, as we mentioned earlier, setting boundaries is extremely important when it comes to communicating well at work and setting yourself up for success.
well, we've alluded to some of this already for the sake of time, but again, thinking about it from the perspective of your employer, approaching each conversation with a plan. These are, you need to come prepared. It shows the commitment on your part. There is a commitment to work. If you choose to work, if you're able to work, there is still that same commitment that you are giving, the commitment on the caregiving side. And so coming prepared for conversations with your employer show that you're making the effort.
Yeah, absolutely. And for the sake of time, you all have access to these slides, so you can read some of these examples for just how to start what can sometimes be an uncomfortable conversation. And, as we've mentioned today, being prepared, being informed, and practicing are really, really important in terms of being able to properly and effectively communicate when you're at work. And that includes something called the swivel, which is a way to sort of redirect a conversation that might be cancer focused that you don't want it to be. So again, there's some examples on this slide, but it can be a really useful tool in terms of also setting boundaries for yourself and the information you would like to share while you're at work. And of course, the challenges of caregiving can feel enormous. So I like to always leave with a selection from a caregiver's bill of rights that just provides some really valuable reminders and affirmations. So I encourage people to download it, keep a copy of it on hand if you are having a rough day or need a reminder of why it's important that what you're doing is what you're doing. And as I mentioned, here are some legal resources that can be helpful if you are doing more of that fact finding and research into some of the protections. I will let you know that we have one more webinar coming up on December 4th, which will be focused on self-care, which can certainly apply to both patients and survivors as well as caregivers. I will hand it back to Scott.
Thank you so much. Just quickly going through our events, we also have our Midwest conference coming up March 28th. Registration just went live today, so we hope that you will join us for that. That's going to be an all-day conference on various topics and speakers around the working in cancer conversation. We also have our national and West Coast conferences coming up later in the year in 2025. This here's Nicole's information. If you have any questions afterwards, feel free to reach out to Nicole, as well as Brandon's LinkedIn if you want to connect with him after today as well.
Happy to connect with anyone. Thank you both.
So I'm going to leave up this slide here for anybody requesting CEs. Again, have all the information there. You're going to get an email tomorrow, again, with all this information and with the links to the evaluation and the post-test. So we are pretty much on time right now. I do have one question I want to get to before we finish today, which is my boss has been supportive so far, but I can feel some resentment growing. Is there a way to prove I'm still committed to my job while also making sure that my loved one is being taken care of?
Is that in the chat? I'm sorry.
No, that was a question we got here.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you want me to address that? Can you ask that one more time? I know we have like a minute to go.
My boss has been supportive so far, but I can feel some resentment growing. Is there a way to prove I'm still committed to my job while also making sure my loved one is being taken care of?
Well, I think the most important thing is to be able to share sort of any timeline that you can, right? So there are certain times where you might be busier on the caregiving side than others. So preemptively sort of saying the next week I might be a little harder to reach but the following week I will definitely be available. So I think it might mean that you might have to sort of communicate the sort of the latest scheduling, a little bit to set expectations. It sounds like if you're feeling that way, it could potentially be that it has something to do with expectations, but it could, I mean, honestly, it could be anything. It could be that they're going through something that you don't even know about. I mean, things happened yesterday that are emotionally draining to people that we're dealing with at my office today. So, always try to, while you're already caregiving and doing everything else that you're doing, sometimes, continue to put yourself for a second in their shoes and sort of try to make sure that you're addressing what might be concerning them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, utilizing some of what we talked about before of scheduling check-ins, maybe saying like, hey, let's have this modified schedule for 3 months and we'll have a check-in at the end. If it's working, great. If it's not, let's, readdress our plan. So I think it's just about, like you said, just being upfront and honest to the extent that it's necessary in terms of sharing information with them so that that resentment doesn't grow and they don't feel like you've become a burden versus someone that they can work with.
Yeah, like communication really is just so key here. And, if you're behind on a project, letting somebody know and not letting it just slip behind, even if it's an uncomfortable conversation of like a deadline that you missed or something, that it's better to be, I think upfront about something that might need addressing rather than like sitting there and hoping it goes away after a month, which it's probably not going to.
And if it ever continues to feel like it's escalating, hopefully you have an HR representative or someone that might be the appropriate time to
Yeah.
just check in. You know, you can just check in with an HR person potentially.
Yeah, that's a great thing. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. If we didn't get to your questions today, again, please shoot us an email at cancerandcareers@cew.org. Or if you think of something next week or next month or in 6 months from now, we're always available to answer those questions one-on-one for you as well. But thank you so much, Nicole. Thank you so much, Brandon, for being here. I appreciate all of your time, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Have a good night.